How's it going, everybody? Adrian Simple here from the Gaming Observer, and welcome to the deep dive of Neon Abyss. Folks, this is a video that is going to be going into all of the intricacies and various mechanics of the game Neon Abyss. If you would like to hear my review of the game, that is also available on this YouTube channel. Because while I was able to talk about that in about 5 minutes, what I want to do on this show is really go into everything that the game does and assess how well it does it. There is definitely some important context that I need to give you here first, though. First of all, I did receive this game for free. I was given an early copy of the game by Team 17, so thank you to that team for that. And as of this point, I have put in 20 hours into the game on the normal mode. So I haven't played easy or hard mode, and I definitely haven't seen everything that this game has to offer, but I'm going to talk more about that. If there is a specific aspect of the game that you would like to check out, feel free to look at the timestamps in the description below, and you'll see everything that I'm going to cover. Otherwise, let's get into this. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do here is just give you a general overview of my feelings on the game. Again, if you heard my 5-minute review-like episode, then a lot of this is going to sound familiar. But either way, what I want to say here right off the bat is that Neon Abyss is a tremendous game. It is incredibly fun, the core gameplay loop is satisfying, and honestly, it's probably going to go up there as one of the, best roguelikes made in a very long time. The thing that I've been trying to say as often as possible is that it takes the best elements of The Binding of Isaac and Enter the Gungeon, and even more importantly, it removes the worst elements of those games. From Isaac, it has the item synergies and the flow of a given run. But one of the problems with Isaac is that things aren't always clear as terms of how the game runs. Neon Abyss is very clear, and I'm going to talk about that. Enter the Gungeon, on the other hand, it has the uniqueness that game does. All the guns feel very different, they all have a charm to them, except what it does better is that it doesn't feel so chaotic. It has chaos, and it harnesses that chaos, but it doesn't feel out of control like Enter the Gungeon can. And I really just wanted to start this whole thing off with those statements because, I'm going to be nitpicking this game a lot, I'm going to be getting into the nitty-gritty of it all, and I think if you hear too much of that in a row, it's going to sound, like I didn't like the game or I didn't appreciate the game. But really, there is a reason why I put 20 hours into it, and that the major problems that I have with the game aren't going to interfere with me putting another 20 hours into it or more. Because, one of the real issues with this game is the fact that progression is incredibly slow. I have in my notes that when I was 7 hours into playing the game, I had already felt like I had seen the entire game. And that definitely isn't the case, because there's a tremendous amount of the game that you can unlock over time. But because it took so long to unlock those things, you already see everything that exists in the first place. And thankfully, that is offset by the fact that playing the game is tremendously fun. And so I'm willing to go through the ringer to unlock everything. Anyway, I'm going to be getting into details of all of that, so let's go ahead and jump right in here. First of all, I think that the most important thing that you need to take a look at when it comes to a game like this is the combat. Roguelikes are very mechanically driven, and I would say almost all of them, or maybe all of them, are combat driven. That's the main aspect of the game. If the combat is bad, then the game is probably bad. And so with that said, the combat or the fighting in Neon Abyss is really good. It's really fun. I mean, you can see it on screen here. There's lots going on, there's lots of enemies to fight, plenty of different approaches that you can take when it comes to how you approach an encounter, depending on the items that you have and the guns that you have, and the room layout and whatnot. And, like I was saying before, I feel like there's a good level of chaos going on, where there's plenty of bullets flying around and enemies getting thrown at you, and lots of flashy lights going off as you shoot. But ultimately, your brain is able to keep a track of everything going on, and you don't feel left behind. You don't feel like, I didn't see that bullet come out of nowhere. Or, I got screwed over by the game. Ultimately, you do feel in control of everything that's going on. I think one of the strengths of this game is its use of movement, and we're going to talk more about movement later, but the way that it integrates movement into its combat, it's lots of verticality, lots of, navigating the various walls that get thrown in your way. With something like The Binding of Isaac, it's a little harder because really all you can do is have rocks that get in the way, right? And maybe putting in some enemies in there that are creating kind of mini puzzles. But in this case, when it comes to the combat, there's a lot of movement that goes on where you need to watch for more than just the enemies shooting at you. And I think that was done very successfully. And then, you know, one of the obviously most important things about combat is the enemies themselves. Unfortunately, I would say that the lack of enemy variety becomes very apparent very quickly. You know, there's a number of floors that you can go down, and you're going to see the same enemies on every floor, and you're going to learn the patterns of those enemies fairly quickly. Again, like I said, I probably understood everything that was going on by hour 7, at least. From my understanding, more enemies will be unlocked as you progress through the game. At least, that is what happened to me. There are some enemies that I had never seen before appeared when I suddenly unlocked a new skill. But, you know, as it stands, enemy variety tends to be fairly lacking, I would say. And again, that's not a tremendously bad thing. It's still fun to fight these enemies even after you know how they work, and I find that they present a level of challenge that, you know, it's not a situation where you just figure out how that enemy works and then you can just sweep through it. It still presents a challenge, even if you know what to expect. And so that kind of brings me to the next part of this game and the combat of this game, and that's bosses. And the major bosses that you fight at the end of each floor. You know, these are often supposed to be the cornerstones of a roguelike, where they are the gatekeepers of progression on both a micro and a macro level. And while I feel as though the Neon Abyss bosses are very fun, they look really cool, they're designed very well, when it comes to actually fighting those bosses, it feels like they missed the mark. I would say that most of them are just a little too easy and a little too predictable. Every single boss has 2 phases, and both of the phases aren't that different from each other usually. And ultimately, and unfortunately, what these things usually boil down to is I point my mouse on top of the boss and then I just try to avoid the bullets. Which I know is what every encounter is when you really boil it down, but in this case, that's just what it felt like I was doing. It didn't feel like I had to figure things out or come across some kind of challenge that I wasn't expecting. I actually think that the bosses are one of the major strengths of something like The Binding of Isaac, where you very much need to learn enemy patterns. Every single boss generally feels differently from one another, and going into the fight can, you know, the boss that you get can really determine the outcome of your run. For me and for Neon Abyss, in most cases, it didn't matter who you fought. It didn't matter, you know, what enemy came up, because I was just going to point my gun at them and shoot them, and that was going to be the end of it. And on the normal mode for Neon Abyss, I would say that the bosses are actually really easy. I didn't try it on hard, but unless that's going to be changing their attack patterns, I don't imagine my opinion would be swayed. In typical roguelike fashion, they also have these super bosses. So, you know, Mom from The Binding of Isaac, or Mom's Heart, Blue Baby, etc. In this game, they have a few of them. They have one on level 5, one on level 7, and then a few that you can unlock over time. Which, you know, I don't want to get into spoiler territory or anything, but again, these super bosses that you see every single time that you're gonna have to fight if you have a really long run, they usually ultimately boil down to point your gun into a single place and run around. So, you know, that was a bit of a letdown for me. I would say the bosses could have been greatly expanded on. But in another facet, you know, the way that I view Neon Abyss and the way that I've talked about the combat so far is that it's not necessarily about those pivotal moments, but really it's about the consistency, and it's about building up your item synergies and getting the right gun and whatever it is, just to run the marathon instead of the sprint. And if bosses are just considered another step on that journey, then, you know, I'm willing to get down with that. And that's also why I would say this isn't a tremendous negative on the game. This isn't a reason why you shouldn't buy Neon Abyss. It's just something I noticed. Okay, so now let's go on the flip side of this. I said that the bosses were a little too static, a little too repetitive, maybe just part of the motion of the game. I feel like the opposite of that is when you start looking at movement and the way that you interact with the map. I have said it already, but the way that you move around a given level or the map itself, it's always really well done. They use lots of verticality, lots of jumping, lots of things to interact with, and then the movement itself can be altered in a lot of ways, notably things like adding flight or extra jumps. And I think because of that, because they've allowed you to, I don't know, play around a little bit with the way that you move around the map, it just makes the experience a little bit more interesting room to room. In something like The Binding of Isaac, it can often feel like you are just going room to room. You just have to clear this room, and then you can get to the item room, and then you can get to the boss, whatever it is. Whereas in this game, it feels like when I enter a room, I am in for a new experience. I'm gonna have a mini puzzle that I need to figure out in order to get access to a chest. Or I'm gonna have to maneuver my way around various obstacles in order to get access to an enemy that's out of my sight, or, you know, whatever it is. And I think ultimately that is the reason why it feels so good to play Neon Abyss, and having a run end early, or having a run where you don't necessarily get anything done, it doesn't feel like that big of a blow, because it still essentially gives you these little mini challenges as you walk along. As for the map itself, I think that it can be a little bit static. You always know what to expect from the map. You're always gonna have an item room, a mini game, a shop, a boss, a hidden room. And so in one aspect, it's nice because you know what to do. It makes you feel prepared. On the other hand, it lacks a little bit of variety. It makes the rooms not feel as special, though I don't know if there's any roguelike that has really pulled something like that off. I will say the map has a good teleport system. It takes it from Gungeon, where you have these hubs of rooms that you can teleport to, and then rooms in between that are connecting them. Very convenient, especially when walking around can be fairly slow. It was a good decision to have that. I will say that one of the things that adds a nice level of variety is how you actually get into these various rooms. Sometimes you need to pay with a key, or a bomb, or crystals, or your health. There's kind of 4 different ways that you can enter in, and it's not always the same for every single room, which is nice. It means that if you're really low on crystals, but then all of a sudden you get presented with a bunch of rooms that need crystals, you know, that adds another kink into your run. And I think that makes up for the fact that certain rooms are always the same. You know, the shop always has the same items at 15, 30, 50, and 70 cents. The arena room is just tremendously easy. It's basically a free item. The hidden rooms never really give you something special. So while the payoff may not necessarily be the most exciting thing, the way that you can actually get into those rooms adds the variety. So on that note, let's talk a little bit about the economy and the various things that you can use to spend and the resources that you can pick up. Overall, I would say that it's done generally well. I think that there's a lot of items in the game that interact with the various resources you can come across. Obviously, we talked about the room entry and spending these things to get access to the map. And while you do definitely have moments where you either have too much of something or not enough of something, I think that's just part of the pendulum of roguelike resource management. The only thing I will say is that you tend to come across quite a few items that will just totally invalidate something. Usually grenades, like there's a number of items that will do explosions or fire off rockets, and what ends up happening is you just use that instead of an actual grenade, and you end up racking dozens and dozens of grenades into your resources that you never need to use. And I would say that tends to happen more often than not with at least one of the things that you have. However, I haven't played the game long enough to really know if that's an issue or if that's just, you know, again, part of the journey. Something to be expected along the way. Again, I do want to reiterate, though, that I think one of the strengths of this game is how they actually use those resources. You know, every gun has an active item that costs something. Well, usually costs something. So it'll be like, you know, use 3 crystals to improve your fire rate on this room. Or spend 10 coins and hatch an egg, or something like that. And then there's also a number of items that you can pick up that are like, hey, the more money you have, the faster you shoot. And then that incentivizes you to not spend your money. Or even better, the one I like is the less health you have or the less crystals you have, the more damage you do, etc. Meaning you're incentivized to not pick things up, and you're kind of kept at like a dangerously low rate. I think interacting with the resources like that makes the game, again, a lot more exciting. It makes the differentiations between the various runs. And that's what can really make them memorable. I remember a few of my runs simply because of the synergies that went between items and economy. And I do want to talk about the items, but before we get there, I want to touch on the faith system. So throughout the time that you're playing the game, you get this little bar in the bottom right, which shows you the faith system. And this is very obviously inspired from the deal with the devil mechanic from The Binding of Isaac, where essentially you have a devil room and an angel room, and it is incredibly easy to get to the devil room, but you have to sacrifice health, and it's very hard to get to the Angel Room, but it is a free item. And so throughout the game, you have the opportunity to spend your crystals on entering a room, or just randomly coming across a purple crystal in the middle of a room. And the more crystals that you spend, the larger your bar goes up, and then ultimately you get access to an Angel Room, or a Faith Room, whatever it's called in this game. However, you always have the opportunity to essentially corrupt the given purple room or purple crystal that you come across by dealing damage to it. So, for example, in order to get into the shop, you always need to spend 3 crystals. That is going to increase your purple bar in the bottom right. However, if you shoot your gun at the door to the shop, then it turns the door red, and the only way to now get into the shop is by basically running yourself against it and taking damage. You know, it gets all spiky. Same thing, sometimes you'll get like a purple crystal chest. In order to open it, you need to spend 2 crystals, but if that chest takes damage in any way, it could even be an enemy dealing damage to it, then the only way to open the chest is by dealing damage to yourself, and your bar in the bottom right turns red. And that's the basic system, and you kind of just go back and forth between the two throughout your entire run. Again, with it being much, much easier to grow the bar of it being red, but that means ultimately when you go to get your item, you need to sacrifice one of your health containers. I think that the system is really well done for a number of reasons. The biggest one being that it's really clear how it works. That's definitely one of the positives of this game, is you always know what's going on, and especially when it comes to this, where you're actually sacrificing a health container, that's a major move. They tell you exactly how it needs to happen, there's no confusion. And that's definitely an issue that other games will have. But the other thing is that it just kind of feels like it really fits into the game. It gives a really nice purpose to the crystals, because otherwise I'm really hesitant with spending my crystals, either on a gun's active item or whatever else it needs to be. In this case, it really feels good to spend my crystals because I'm going, hey, I might get a good item in the end because of it. And obviously, most importantly, it just makes you make a choice. It makes you decide between sacrifice and challenge. And that's something that you can find in every game, right? And in this case, it's done really well. There are some nitpicky things about the system. For example, sometimes a room entry or a purple chest, they'll just get corrupted and you won't have any chance to really fix that. Usually it's just an enemy that spawns and is automatically attacking it. That's always unfortunate. When you don't really have control over it and you remove that agency from the player, it kind of loses the fun of it. On the same token, if the room is done well, if it's positioned well, then the challenge of trying to get to it before it gets corrupted can be a lot of fun, and is kind of another sacrifice within itself, because you might take damage along the way. The other thing I'll say is that the items in the sacrifice room, where you have to remove a heart container in exchange for an item, sometimes those items aren't actually all that great. I often found myself going, really? I spent a heart container on this? Which obviously that's part of learning the game and finding out, you know, what items are worth it. And ultimately, down the line, when I've learned what all the items do, that's not going to be a problem. But for someone who's maybe playing the game for the first couple of runs, or even where I'm at now, where I haven't learned all the items, that might be an issue. But hey, we're here now, let's talk about them, the items in the game. Obviously, one of the most pivotal and pillar aspects of it. And really what I want to say about the items is that few of them are going to radically change your game, but what I really love is that they give you a lot of really small pushes into creating a run that is memorable. So there's a whole bunch of different items, and there's lots of different ways that the game can be impacted by these items, but they usually just make a small little change here and there. And then ultimately you end up picking 20 or 25 items over the course of a run, and all of a sudden you have something really unique. You have synergies that you weren't expecting, you got really lucky, and you got a lot of items of the same type, whatever it is. It really drives home that theory that this game is really about the journey and not necessarily pivotal moments and turning points. Don't get me wrong, there definitely are items in the game which are just going to change everything. You know, if you gain flight, then that's just basically, I don't want to say game winning, but it does a lot for you. With all of that said though, because of the fact that we're missing kind of these landmark items that you always want to look out for and pick up every single time, you end up getting onto the flip side of that, which is that a lot of these items end up feeling pointless, or at least disappointing. A lot of the items that interact with the economy that you have, for example, the resource management, I talked before that they're really cool, they're a great idea, and sometimes they can really work out. But sometimes you get an item that's like, hey, the less crystals that you have, the more melee damage you do. And in a game where you don't really do a whole lot of melee damage, you're usually focused on shooting rather than trying to hit someone with your knife, that can come across as very disappointing. Now, obviously that can spiral, right? You can get a lot of items that interact with melee damage, and that's something you end up wanting to prioritize. Or you get a gun that actually deals melee damage, in which case, obviously, that's very helpful. But a lot of the times, if you have a short run, or you just don't get the chance to have those synergies, they almost become inconsequential sometimes. And that's not the greatest thing. Especially because in a lot of cases, you are having a strong element of sacrifice to get the item. I mentioned the sacrifice room before, where you're potentially giving up a heart container. Sometimes you're spending 70 cents in a shop, which in this game is a lot of money. If you're not, like, overflowing with money, then spending 70 cents can be a lot. And so when you're let down in that sense before you figured out what all of these items do, at least in the early game, it's unfortunate. Again, once you've spent hundreds and hundreds of hours with the game, it's not going to be so bad. But for most of you, that's the important thing to know. And that's why I gotta say, it's really important to learn what these items do and really take, like, an active role in trying to memorize the visuals and the names and the effects. Because also, in some cases, these items can work against you. One of the items in the game will turn your eggs into, like, these mini grenades, where basically as soon as the egg comes into contact with a rock or something like that, it just explodes, and you lose your egg. Well, that's going to really suck if you actually want your eggs, and now you have no ability to drop this item, which is losing all of your eggs, whatever it is. Sometimes you get items like that. Now, obviously, items are a really big aspect of this game. I would say the other really big aspect of this game are the guns, and that's heavily apparent if you're looking at the footage right now. I will say, I love the guns. I think they're absolutely tremendous. If you've played Enter the Gungeon, you know that game has a lot of unique distinction between all of the guns that they have. It's always very fun to pick up a new one and see what it does. And this game definitely has an element of that. Every single gun does feel unique, and does feel like you need to adapt your playstyle depending on what you have in your hands. They're also really great for synergies, when you upgrade your weapon, or you get an item that turns your bullets into explosions, or you add the number of bullets that are coming out of your gun at once. There can be some really fun interactions that you definitely weren't expecting when you play through the game. I would definitely say there are some downsides to the guns that aren't major, which I know is sounding familiar at this point, but here they are very basically. Some guns feel worse than the basic gun upgraded, so if you end up getting a lot of upgrades early on and not a new gun, then the gun that you start with usually just is good enough, and you'll try out some new guns and you're like, the one I have is dealing enough damage and doing enough that I don't feel the need to try out something new. Many of the guns also have active abilities, I mentioned those before, and I would say that usually these things tend to go unused. Many of them you end up wanting to save just for the boss, so like if you spend 2 crystals to increase your damage for a room, usually you just save that for the boss, because that's the most difficult room. And you're not usually overflowing with crystals on a given floor that you want to waste them. And same thing, sometimes you get a gun that wants to spend your coins, and I would say more often than not, you have things on the floor that you want to spend your coins on, as opposed to whatever active item your gun has. And the last thing I'll mention is that if you do end up changing from your basic gun, it was pretty rare that I ever went for a third gun. Usually, once you have your run figured out, then it's figured out, and you don't want to spend the 50 cents at the shop to buy a new gun. Which maybe in one aspect is actually a good thing, because it establishes your run early and it gives you the opportunity to kind of build around that. And in a sense, it's also going to mean that every run will feel a little different if you're only going with one gun throughout. So you can see that in both a good and a bad way, I suppose. I've got one more major mechanic that I want to talk about before we get to my major issue with the game, and that's the pets and the eggs. I think that this is a really unique aspect to the game, especially when you watch the footage for the first time. One of the things that really stands out is you're looking at these eggs that are following the character around, or the pets that eventually hatch out of those eggs. And I've got to say, this was actually one of the things I was looking forward to the most when I started this game, because it looked like there was so much variety, and there was so much features that interacted with these pets. They can hatch out of the eggs, they might or might not hatch out of the eggs, sometimes it fails. You can level up these pets over time. The pets have HP of their own, which means that they can just die in the battlefield. And it was with a really heavy heart that I found out that they actually are pretty inconsequential. They probably do a lot of damage when I'm not paying attention, but the truth is you end up racking up like potentially more than a dozen pets on a given run, and none of them really feel like they're changing your game all that much. Most of the time they level up and I don't even notice, or they die and I don't even notice. And eventually it just got to the point that I didn't even care. I would pick up the egg, I would let them hatch, I would let them die, and I wouldn't even think about it. And in fact, the only time that I really did notice them was when they were screwing up my run. And if you go and you look at the Steam reviews for this game, you're going to see a lot of hate for one pet in particular, which is the cat. And basically, the cat will automatically go and collect hearts for you, except it'll turn those hearts into something called a moldy heart, which is a worse version of the regular heart, where it'll either heal you or it will damage you. It's like a gamble. And of course, if you're down to half a heart and you need to pick up a moldy heart, it could end your run. And I'll tell you that you really notice the pet at that moment. Or if you really end up needing hearts and then your guy goes and collects them and turns them into shields. Or there's one pet called the Grabber, which goes and takes all of your money. At least the Grabber, what he'll do is when he dies, he just drops all of the money that he collected, which means that you end up getting like 100 to 150 coins down the line, as opposed to over the course of multiple floors. At least there's some payoff with him, but it can still be really annoying. You know, if you see something that you really want on the floor, you know that you're probably not going to get it because the Grabber keeps taking all your money. And so in some cases, when I was just a little bit too desperate for health, I wouldn't even pick up an egg because it could turn into the cat and it could ruin my run. I'll say that the pets end up being the most beneficial when they are activators for item synergies. I got a lot of items that said the more pets that you have or the more eggs that you have, you can do X. There's actually one gun in the game which says your eggs will never hatch, which means that you're never going to have pets that will die. And so I had one item that said the more eggs you have, the faster your gun will shoot. Well, in combination with this gun where eggs never hatch, I ended up having like 25 eggs following behind me, and I was shooting the gun like crazy. It was faster than anything I'd seen at that point. That was a really nice interaction, and that made those pets very memorable. But unfortunately, that was because I had an item that relied on them, not because they were themselves. Okay, and that's going to bring us on to the major issue I have with the game. That's the progression and the skill tree. Folks, I said this at the beginning, I nitpicked a lot of this game. I presented the goods and the bads of everything, and maybe in some cases it did sound like the bads were bad. But ultimately, everything that I've addressed up to this point, the combat, the bosses, even the eggs, I would say that mostly everything is a net positive. I have a tremendous time going through the game, the moment-to-moment gameplay in the core gameplay loop is satisfying, and it feels varied, which is really important when it comes to a roguelike. However, the one thing that I cannot say good things about is the progression and the skill tree, because it is way too slow. You heard me talk about this on the 5-minute review, but here, let me break it down for you. So every time that you kill a boss in the game, you get some kind of token. You get this little fiery token. And then ultimately what you can do is spend those tokens on an overarching skill tree, which you can access in between your various runs, and it will unlock things. It'll unlock a skill or a new aspect of the floor or an item. But the problem is, when you go to unlock one of those things, it can sometimes cost 10, 15, 20 tokens. Which means, you know, in some cases, 3 or 4 runs that are really long, just to unlock, like, a new item into the game. Folks, I've played 20 hours of this game, and there are 6 unlockable characters. I've only gotten 1. And so, ultimately, the problem with this is that it feels like I've already seen most of the game. I said this in the beginning. I was 7 hours into the game, and then in my notebook it feels like I've seen everything. I'm already seeing repeats of stuff. And ultimately, that's not a tremendously bad thing, because the game is fun. However, I wouldn't have this issue if it just was quicker to unlock things. There are even things that get unlocked when you aren't doing it intentionally. For example, the skill tree has multiple pages, and it appears as though once you unlock something on a new page for the first time, that unlocks new enemies or new aspects of the game that you haven't seen before. That's really cool. I'm so down with that. It adds an element of progression that you weren't expecting, and as you become more familiar with the game, it throws curveballs at you. I think that's a tremendous idea. But the first time that I get my curveball probably shouldn't be 15 hours into the game. And honestly, this is so bad that if the game wasn't as fun as it is, I probably wouldn't continue playing it, because I would have already seen everything. Thankfully, I'm excited to see what comes and to see what new synergies I'm going to get, whatever it is. So I'm going to keep going with it, and I'm a big roguelike fan. But ultimately, this is a major stain on a game that is incredibly fun. Now, I have heard that the developer has heard this feedback. I'm not the only one that has the issue with this, and is going to be patching the game. I don't know to what extent. I don't know if, it's going to be a major overhaul or just a minor one. So definitely keep your eye out on that if this ends up being something that is also a major issue for you, or you don't want to buy the game because of it. I do imagine it's going to get fixed at some point. But if you are going into Neon Abyss and you aren't ready to spend a lot of time with the game, then maybe just hold off for a little bit. If you're a major roguelike fan, if you like Isaac and Gungeon and Rogue Legacy and all that stuff, Dead Cells, then definitely pick up the game. You know you're going to spend a lot of time with it. It's going to be a lot of fun. You're not going to regret it. And you're going to see the game updated over the course of the next year, apparently. But if this is just maybe your entry into the roguelike series, or you just like to, take cursory glances at these kinds of games, then this isn't the one for you just yet. My friends, if you would like to purchase Neon Abyss, you can go over to Steam or the PlayStation or the Nintendo Switch. They are all $20. You can also go over to the Xbox One and purchase it separately, or if you have the Xbox Game Pass, it is also available on both console and PC. And I've said this before, I think it's a tremendous game for the Xbox Game Pass. It gives you the opportunity to kind of jump in and jump out. You don't have to invest a lot of money into it if it's not your thing. And ultimately, you get your chance to at least try the game if you like what you heard today. But if you don't want to stick around for the long term, then you haven't lost any money. You just tried something on the Game Pass, and that's really good. I think that was a really wise move by the developers and the publishers, and if anything, I do encourage you to go try that out, and go try the Game Pass as a whole. It's a tremendous service. Once again, I would like to thank Team 17 for providing me a review code for the game, and if you would like to hear more from me, I have a daily news podcast that you can check out here on this channel. It's also available on the podcast host of your choice, or the Flash Briefings section of Amazon Alexa devices. Folks, that is going to be all for today. Thank you very, very much for joining me. If you have any questions or comments whatsoever, please do not hesitate to reach out. And until next time, happy gaming, everyone.